That's that.
I never go to funerals.
Hollywood in its golden age was a kingdom of light. Camera bulbs burst like tiny suns. Red carpets stretched endlessly, and the silver screen carried faces so luminous they seemed carved from starlight itself. Yet behind that shimmering kingdom, there was another Hollywood quieter, secretive, written not in headlines but in whispers passed behind velvet curtains. Here, love had to wear a mask. Here, devotion was measured not in diamond rings but in silence, loyalty, and the courage to exist unseen. No figure embodied this paradox more hauntingly than Barbara Stanwyck. To audiences, she was indestructible. The femme fatale, who could ruin a man with a glance. The fast-talking comedienne who bent dialogue to her will. The iron spine in a city built on sand. She was called Hollywood's steel orchid, blooming where other women wilted. Yet steel has its own kind of fragility. It bends only for those who know the hidden hinge. For 3 decades, one woman stood at that hinge, Helen Ferguson. Not a headline star, not a face on a marquee, but a guardian of images, a sculptor of reputations, a shield against the unrelenting hunger of the press. To the world, Ferguson was Stanwyck's publicist, her trusted companion, her manager in matters of perception. But history, in its reluctance to name what cannot be named, has left their bond wrapped in ellipses. Were they friends, allies, something deeper? The question lingers like cigarette smoke in a darkened theater, refusing to vanish, refusing to declare itself. What we know is this: while Hollywood consumed marriages like popcorn, Stanwyck and Ferguson built an alliance that endured longer than any studio contract, any box office hit, any fleeting romance engineered for publicity. 30 years of loyalty in a town where loyalty was considered extinct. 30 years of quiet domesticity shadowed by flashing bulbs. 30 years of a love story that never admitted its own name and therefore became all the more irresistible. To watch Stanwyck glide across the screen is to feel both desire and distance she invites and withholds in the same gesture. Perhaps that was her true genius. She turned privacy itself into a performance, and in the wings, Helen Ferguson stood steady, the custodian of that performance, guarding its borders, preserving its mystery. This is not the kind of Hollywood story you find in studio archives or glossy biographies. This is the story written in the margins, preserved in glances, protected by silence. Tonight, we step into that silence. We search for the woman behind the steel orchid, and the other woman who kept her blooming in shadows. Why do these stories matter? Because Hollywood was never just a place of films, it was a stage where identities were scripted, censored, and sold. To survive, stars learned to divide themselves, one self for the camera, another for the mirror, a third that lived only in the shadows. And in that act of survival, entire worlds of passion and truth were hidden, sometimes for lifetimes. Barbara Stanwyck's alliance with Helen Ferguson is not a simple footnote in film history. It is a lens through which we can glimpse the silent architecture of old Hollywood, the networks of loyalty, secrecy, and quiet devotion that allowed women to navigate an industry built against them. It reminds us that glamour was never just about gowns and diamonds. Glamour was also about what remained concealed: the courage to love differently, the discipline to guard that love, and the resilience to outlast the whisper campaigns of a ruthless press. And Stanwyck's story is not alone. She was part of a constellation of women who loved boldly but carefully, whose names we remember for their films but whose private truths still hover like unfinished reels. From Dorothy Arzner, the lone female director who carved her place in a man's world, to Greta Garbo, who turned silence into legend. Each carried her own mixture of radiance and restraint. Together, their stories form a secret history of Hollywood, one that deserves to be told at last. In an age when Hollywood soundstages roared with men barking orders through megaphones, Dorothy Arzner stood apart, sharp-eyed, practical, dressed in tailored suits that defied the era's expectations. She was not simply the only woman to direct in the studio system of the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds. She was a force who carved a new grammar into cinema itself. With films like Dance Girl, Dance, and Christopher Strong, she gave her actresses more than costumes and lighting. She gave them agency, a rare luxury in a town addicted to controlling women's images. Her achievements were monumental. She became the first woman admitted into the Directors Guild of America, and later, her teaching at UCLA shaped the instincts of a young Francis Ford Coppola. Yet it was not only her career that made her singular. Off-screen, she lived with an integrity that was radical for its time. Arzner formed lasting bonds with women, most famously the choreographer Marion Morgan. While gossip columnists sniffed around, Arzner never staged false romances or entered lavender marriages to appease public morality. She allowed her work to speak, and her private life to remain hers. Still, that choice carried shadows. She often found herself marginalized by the studios, her independence mistaken for defiance. When the system she had helped pioneer began to shrink her opportunities, she withdrew from Hollywood rather than conform. Yet her quiet courage echoed long after. In a world where most women were written out of the director's chair, Arzner etched her name across 24 films and left a trail for others to follow. Her legacy is not only the movies themselves, but the proof that a woman could direct, command, and endure without surrendering her truth. In that, Dorothy Arzner was more than a filmmaker. She was a prophecy. Tallulah Bankhead was a storm in human form, restless, dazzling, impossible to ignore. On stage, she spoke with a husky voice that seemed dipped in whiskey and velvet, a sound so distinct that radio audiences could identify her after a single syllable. On screen, her eyes carried the reckless promise of adventure, a challenge to anyone who dared to tame her. In the 1,930 seconds and 40 seconds, when Hollywood's leading ladies were sculpted into obedient silhouettes, Bankhead ripped through the mold with a laugh as sharp as broken glass. Her brilliance was matched only by her appetite for life. She drank fiercely, smoked incessantly, and loved without apology. The industry whispered of her many romances. With women whispers, she never rushed to silence. One contemporary quipped that nearly every prominent lesbian of the era had, at some point, crossed paths with Tallulah. She did marry once, to actor John Emery, but their union dissolved within 4 years. After that, she declared her independence absolute. But freedom came at a cost. The Hays Office, Hollywood's moral watchdog, deemed her unsuitable for the public. Because of her unfiltered tongue and refusal to conform, roles dwindled, and producers hesitated to work with a woman who could not be controlled. Yet Bankhead transformed even rejection into theater. When asked about her brief flings, she would shrug, "I go into them impulsively, and I forget them just as quickly." Her shadow, however, stretches beyond the gossip. Bankhead's refusal to bow to convention made her an icon for future generations who sought to live boldly. She carried her scandals like trophies, her wit like a weapon, and her passions like a torch. In a city built on caution, Tallulah Bankhead remained gloriously, destructively unafraid. Marlene Dietrich never simply entered a room, she conquered it. Draped in tuxedos or satin gowns, cigarette poised like a weapon of elegance, she carried herself with a sovereignty that mocked categories. Critics often described her as an enchantress without fixed gender, masculine in her command, feminine in her allure, irresistible in her contradictions. On screen, she was a mirage that refused to resolve, a promise that glamour could be both dangerous and liberating. Her roots were in Berlin's feverish nightlife of the 1,920 seconds, a city alive with jazz, cabaret, and rebellion. There, Dietrich tasted a freedom that Hollywood could never replicate. Women, men, and everyone between moved in her orbit, drawn by her audacity to live on her own terms. When she crossed the Atlantic and became a star under Paramount's spotlight, she did not abandon that freedom, she smuggled it into her image. Wearing trousers on set, flirting openly at parties, she embodied a sexuality that blurred borders like smoke across a mirror. Yet, Hollywood was less forgiving than Berlin. Studio bosses adored the profit she generated but trembled at the rumors she provoked. Her affairs with men were documented. Her liaisons with women whispered in corridors, sometimes with awe, sometimes with scorn. Dietrich herself fanned the flames, once remarking that she had no need to deny what the world already imagined. She danced over boundaries, not cautiously but flamboyantly, in heels that left sparks on the floor. Her legacy is one of emancipation. Long before words like fluid or non-binary entered cultural vocabulary, Marlene Dietrich embodied them on celluloid. She proved that glamour could be rebellion, that sensuality could live beyond definition. In the golden age of Hollywood, where masks were mandatory, Dietrich wore none, and in doing so, she became eternal. Before Hollywood learned how to polish its stars into perfection, Alla Nazimova blazed across stage and screen with a ferocity that could not be tamed. Born in Russia and trained in the art of theater, she arrived in America with a voice like thunder and a vision that unsettled the complacent. On Broadway, she was revered. In silent films, her intensity burned through the frame. But it was her life beyond the screen that carved her into legend. Nazimova coined a phrase that became both shield and secret: the sewing circle. In public, it was a harmless expression, but behind closed doors it signified a clandestine network of women actresses, writers, directors who loved other women in an era that demanded silence. Through this quiet code, she created a sanctuary of belonging, where passion could survive outside the glare of studio morality. Her estate on Sunset Boulevard, known as the Garden of Allah, became the stage for that sanctuary. By day, it was a hotel buzzing with actors and artists. By night, it transformed into a refuge of laughter, music, and desire unbound by rules. Guests whispered of wild gatherings, but beneath the scandal lay something deeper, a place where women could exhale, if only for an evening, without fear of exposure. Nazimova herself lived unapologetically with her partner, Gluska Marshall, until the end of her days. Though her star dimmed in the studio system and her career waned, the ripples of her defiance lingered. She dared to imagine a Hollywood that could contain truth as well as illusion. Her legacy is both architectural and emotional. The Garden of Allah, remembered as a sanctuary of freedom, and the sewing circle, remembered as a lifeline. In a city devoted to disguises, Alla Nazimova left behind the blueprint for authenticity. Katharine Hepburn never asked permission to exist. She simply arrived, unvarnished and undeniable. Long before Hollywood tried to package her into a star, young Hepburn was already dismantling conventions. As a child, she cut her hair short, called herself Jimmy, and roamed the streets like a boy determined to outrun expectation. That refusal to bend became her signature. On screen, she was sharp, athletic, articulate, and unapologetically herself. The industry admired her brilliance yet bristled at her defiance. While other actresses paraded in gowns, Hepburn appeared in trousers, hands shoved in pockets, shoulders square as if daring the world to argue. Studio executives groaned, but audiences sensed a rare electricity here. Was a woman not sculpted to please, but forged to command. Her performances in The Philadelphia Story and Bringing Up Baby showcased not a demure heroine, but a quicksilver intellect wrapped in elegance. Behind the camera, whispers trailed her. She was inseparable from her college friend Laura Harding, who devoted years to Hepburn's career and personal life. Whether theirs was friendship or romance, it carried an intimacy that defied Hollywood's rigid binaries. Later, rumors linked her to women as often as men, though Hepburn herself never confirmed nor denied. Her silence became a kind of armor inviting speculation while maintaining sovereignty. The price of such independence was steep. In the mid-1,930 seconds, she was labeled box office poison, her refusal to conform nearly ending her career. Yet she fought her way back, not by surrendering, but by reshaping the roles themselves. Over time, she claimed 4 Academy Awards, proof that authenticity could triumph over convention. Hepburn's legacy is not just cinematic, it is philosophical. She rewrote the script of femininity, proving that strength, wit, and vulnerability could inhabit the same figure. In a Hollywood that demanded submission, Katharine Hepburn built an empire on resistance. Greta Garbo arrived in Hollywood like a riddle wrapped in satin. Her face sculpted, remote, luminous, seemed designed not for conversation but for worship. On screen, she conveyed oceans of longing with the smallest gesture. Her silences louder than dialogue, her stillness more powerful than any flourish. Audiences surrendered to her mystery, and soon the industry anointed her as the divine. But Garbo's true power lay in what she withheld. While studio publicity machines demanded tales of romances and perfect domesticity, she refused to play the game. She rarely gave interviews, declined the glitter of premieres, and offered the public nothing but her work. This cultivated silence made her untouchable, yet also profoundly alluring. Fans ached to know her. Garbo only deepened the ache by disappearing further into shadows. Behind the enigma, there were whispers of tenderness. She shared a lasting companionship with writer and actress Salka Viertel, whose home became a sanctuary for émigrés and misfits. Through Viertel, Garbo met the flamboyant Mercedes de Acosta, a poet and playwright who adored her with ferocity. Letters and recollections suggest a bond of passion and anguish, though Garbo herself never named it. She carried the relationship like she carried everything guarded, private, a treasure she would not yield to the world's appetite. Her reserve came at a price. Some saw her as cold, inaccessible, even tragic in her isolation. Yet Garbo's refusal to conform was itself a radical act. In an industry that feasted on intimacy, she proved that mystery could be a brand, silence could be sensual, and self-possession could eclipse spectacle. Garbo's legacy is paradoxical. She gave the world unforgettable images, while fiercely withholding the life behind them. She showed that, to endure, a star could burn not by exposure, but by eclipse. In her silence, Greta Garbo spoke louder than anyone. Eva Le Gallienne lived for the stage. While Hollywood glittered with its cinematic idols, she built her reputation under theater lights, where every performance was ephemeral yet eternal in memory. With a voice that could soar or whisper, and an intensity that held audiences captive, she was hailed as one of the finest actresses of her generation. Unlike the fleeting images of film, Eva's power was immediate, alive, and impossible to replicate. But behind her commanding presence was a private life riddled with tension. Eva never quite conformed to the boundaries that society or Broadway tried to impose. She loved women openly enough to invite gossip, yet guardedly enough to avoid outright scandal. Her relationships included romances with actresses such as Alla Nazimova and writer Mercedes de Acosta, women who themselves lived at the edge of Hollywood's whisper networks. For a time, she shared her life with director Margaret Webster, with whom she co-founded the American Repertory Theater, a bold act of artistic independence. Her choices, however, carried consequences. In 1927, when her affair with actress Josephine Hutchinson became public, the press erupted in sensational headlines. Hutchinson was still married, and Eva became an unwilling symbol of scandal. Wounded by betrayal and ridicule, she confided to a friend that loving women meant a life of tragedy. Yet despite her sorrow, she returned to the stage again and again, pouring the rawness of her heartbreak into her performances. Eva's legacy is that of resilience. She never achieved the fame of screen sirens, but her dedication to theater transformed American drama. She proved that art could survive the weight of rumor, and that authenticity, however costly, could feed the flame of creation. In her triumphs and in her pain, Eva Le Gallienne embodied the stage itself, fleeting, vulnerable, but forever unforgettable. Joan Crawford was Hollywood's great shapeshifter. She began as a dancer, leaping across chorus lines with a ferocity that caught MGM's eye, and transformed herself into a screen goddess whose face could register hunger, ambition, and heartbreak in a single glance. She embodied the American dream, rising from poverty to stardom, her name carved into the firmament of the golden age. Yet, the dream was never free from shadows. Crawford's private life was a mosaic of rumor and contradiction. She admired Greta Garbo from afar, finally meeting her during a film shoot where Garbo touched her face and whispered, "You have a marvelous face." Years later, Crawford would confess, "If there was ever a time in my life when I might have been a lesbian, that was it." For some, it was only a fleeting remark. For others, it was a clue to a hidden story that never quite emerged into daylight. Behind the studio's veneer of glamour lay darker tales. MGM reportedly paid a fortune to bury an early risque film Crawford had made before stardom, a scandal the industry feared might unravel her carefully constructed image. Friends and colleagues hinted at affairs with both men and women, and whispered nicknames like Billy suggested a Crawford few outside her circle ever knew. The paradox was this. While the public saw her as the epitome of femininity, the woman herself lived with a restlessness that refused to be contained by categories. She sought love where she found it, often recklessly, sometimes destructively, yet always on her own terms. Her legacy endures not only in her films Mildred Pierce, Grand Hotel, humoresque, but also in the aura of enigma she left behind. Joan Crawford was more than an actress. She was a battlefield of identities, a woman whose contradictions still ignite fascination. In her, Hollywood's promise and peril fused into a single unforgettable silhouette. Barbara Stanwyck was called many things in her lifetime: the steel orchid, the consummate professional, Hollywood's sharpest survivor. On screen, she moved with a precision that felt almost dangerous, whether plotting a man's downfall in Double Indemnity or trading whip-smart banter in The Lady Eve. Directors adored her discipline, audiences adored her fire, and yet beneath the surface of her career ran a current of silence so carefully guarded it became legendary. Her personal life was deliberately opaque. After a short and troubled marriage to actor Frank Fay, Stanwyck seemed to step off the romantic stage. Instead, another figure emerged beside her, Helen Ferguson, a former actress who reinvented herself as a powerful publicist. For over 3 decades, Ferguson was Stanwyck's constant organizing her press, managing her appearances, and shielding her from Hollywood's insatiable hunger for gossip. To the public, they were simply employer and employee, or at most, close friends. But whispers told a different story. Clifton Webb, a flamboyant actor of the era, once referred to Stanwyck as his favorite American lesbian. Biographers noted the unusual permanence of her bond with Ferguson. While Hollywood devoured marriages, theirs endured. They sometimes lived together, traveled together, and crafted a fortress of privacy that resisted every tabloid intrusion. What made their alliance remarkable was its endurance in a system designed to expose and consume. In the golden cage of Hollywood, Ferguson became both shield and confidant. She mastered the art of invisibility. A telephone call intercepted, a rumor extinguished, a headline that never saw print. Through her, Stanwyck could remain immaculate, untouchable, beyond the reach of scandal. Yet the very absence of disclosure became its own allure. Audiences sensed something elusive in Stanwyck's performances: an independence, a refusal to surrender to male dominance, a sexuality that was powerful precisely because it could not be claimed. Was this simply acting? Or was it the echo of a private truth kept fiercely her own? Together, Stanwyck and Ferguson wrote a love story without chapters, only margins. It was never announced, never confirmed, but it endured longer than any Hollywood marriage of its time. In their silence lay resilience. In their discretion lay devotion. Barbara Stanwyck's legacy is not diminished by mystery, it is amplified by it. She proved that power could reside in restraint, and that sometimes the most sensual thing in Hollywood is the secret that refuses to be told. Mercedes Acosta was never the star on the screen, but she was the star behind the whispers. A playwright, screenwriter, and poet, she moved through Hollywood's golden corridors like a flame carried in secret, small enough to conceal, strong enough to ignite everything it touched. Friends nicknamed her the Muse of the 20th century, and not without reason. Her lovers included some of the most dazzling women of her time. From Eva Le Gallienne's restless passion to Alla Nazimova's electric defiance, Mercedes left a trail of relationships that blurred the line between intimacy and legend. Alice B. Toklas, the partner of Gertrude Stein, once quipped, "Say what you will about Mercedes, she's had the most important women of the 20th century." In the coded landscape of Hollywood's sewing circle, Acosta was both participant and chronicler, a woman who made private love a kind of public rebellion simply by surviving it. But her most enduring bond and her most devastating was with Greta Garbo. The two met in the 1,930 seconds, and Acosta was instantly spellbound. She wrote letters that glowed with longing, describing Garbo in prose that felt more like scripture than correspondence. Garbo, elusive as ever, returned affection in fragments sometimes warm, sometimes glacial, always withholding enough to keep Mercedes suspended between ecstasy and despair. For decades, their connection smoldered, trips together, silences apart, reconciliations that never quite healed. The romance was never officially acknowledged, but the archive of letters tells its own story. Mercedes once declared, "I can get any woman from any man," and for a time, she seemed to prove it. Yet with Garbo, she found a riddle she could not solve, a fortress she could not fully breach. That tension, the intoxication of access, the torment of denial became the defining passion of her life. Hollywood punished her openness. By mid-century, she was dismissed as scandalous, her career fading, her reputation reduced to caricature. But history is kinder. Today, Mercedes de Acosta stands as a symbol of boldness. In an age of erasure, a woman who loved women without apology, who poured her truth into pages and poems even when the world refused to read them. Her legacy is both fragile and immortal. Fragile in the pain it carried, immortal in the way her story illuminates others. In the end, Mercedes de Acosta did not belong to Hollywood. Hollywood belonged to her, if only in the secrets it could never quite silence. Hollywood's golden age is remembered in black and white frames, the gleam of gowns, the roar of premieres, the immortality of film reels spinning in the dark. But the stories we've uncovered tonight remind us that those images were never the whole truth. Behind the carefully lit faces were women who loved on their own terms, quietly, cautiously, and sometimes at great cost. Dorothy Arzner proved that a woman could direct not just movies but her own life, carving paths where none existed. Tallulah Bankhead embodied audacity, teaching us that scandal could be worn like jewelry. Marlene Dietrich blurred gender and sexuality with every flick of her tuxedo cuff, while Alla Nazimova offered sanctuary to those exiled by convention. Katharine Hepburn rewrote femininity itself. Greta Garbo built an empire on silence, and Eva Le Gallienne poured heartbreak into the theater until it burned brighter than any marquee. Joan Crawford balanced myth and rumor. Barbara Stanwyck turned privacy into power with Helen Ferguson at her side. And Mercedes de Acosta immortalized desire in the very letters that nearly destroyed her. Each story is unique, but together they form a hidden history, a parallel Hollywood that existed in the margins of scripts and the pauses between scenes. These women were not allowed to claim their truths openly, yet their very survival was an act of defiance. They gave us performances that still shimmer a century later, even as they carried burdens the cameras never caught. And perhaps that is the paradox of old Hollywood. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. Glamour was never only sequins and champagne. It was also the discipline of silence, the ache of secrecy, the thrill of a glance that could not be spoken aloud. These women remind us that desire is not diminished by discretion. It can, in fact, become more powerful, more enduring, when it is forced to live in whispers. So, the next time you watch an old film and see a face glowing against the darkness, remember that you are witnessing more than a performance. You are seeing the echo of lives lived in contradiction, glory and grief, triumph and concealment, light and shadow. Their legacies survive not because Hollywood allowed them, but because truth, even hidden, has a way of breaking through the screen. If these stories have stirred something in you, if you felt the hush of secrets behind the glitter, the courage beneath the silence, then you've just brushed against the heart of old Hollywood. These women lived in a time when truth could end a career, when love had to disguise itself as friendship, when devotion was measured not in publicity but in perseverance. And yet, they endured. They loved. They left us something more lasting than fame. They left us the courage to look deeper. We want to keep these forgotten voices alive, to make sure their shadows remain part of the story, not erased by it. If you believe their lives matter, if you want more of these hidden histories brought into the light, then stay with us. Like this video, share it with those who cherish the past, and subscribe to our channel. Your support is not just numbers on a screen, it is the echo that ensures these women are not silenced again. Hollywood's golden age is over, but together we can keep its secrets speaking.